All right, for the front output shaft, on the back side of that, and this would be the rear side of this transfer case, we're going to take off this cover plate, and we're going to expect some shims underneath that. Okay, here's our cover plate. And here's our shims. We got 3 different shims, 2 thick ones and a thin one. Now it's my understanding that, again, the bearings are, the standards for the bearings are so, the tolerances are so close that typically people are not having to change their shims. Even though the new master kit came with new shims, we're going to attempt to use these same shims and see if we can obtain 0 end play. And the next thing they want us to do is actually take this race out, and I noticed that this race actually kind of has a slip fitting. And that kind of makes sense because it's this race going in and out based on those shims and this end plate is how we're going to get a 0 lash on this shaft when it's installed properly. So we're going to take out that race. All right, the next thing they want us to do is take off this bearing off of, this is the rear output shaft. And what they want to do is put some blocks of wood back behind this gear to hold it still, and then you hammer this with a mallet. I've got a hydraulic press, so I'm going to use it. So we're going to do something a little different. But so the first thing I want to do is create a flat surface. I don't know if these will get in the way, so let's get these things taken off. I purchased a couple 9/16 inch nuts. These are fine thread, and we'll get these on here. Put some jam nuts against them, and see if we can back these out. If they won't back out easily, we will put a little heat to it. Yeah, that comes out. All right, just to introduce, I got a guest mechanic today. Got Kevin. Kevin is an old friend of Spencer's. They actually played baseball back when they were 7. Went to high school together, and actually went to college and roomed together at college. But Kevin wanted to see how all this stuff went along, so we brought him along, and he's going to help us press out this bearing. All right, so this is the front output shaft, and we want to take off this rear tapered bearing. And the way we're going to do that is put it back in the arbor press, set this gear down against the case, and we're going to press then on this shaft. It'll press the gear, and the bearing will come off at the same time. All right, now we're going to remove the front bearing of the front output shaft. All right, so this is the rear output shaft. This is the rear, this is where the yoke goes. And the very last thing we got to do is get this pilot bearing out of here. This is where the front input shaft actually goes in to this pilot bearing. Problem is, I don't have the special tool it takes to get that out, so we're going to do a bunch of kind of crazy things to try and get this out without damaging any component of this. I do have this little pick piece here. I got this from, I'm pretty sure from Harbor Freight a long time ago. Never really have used it, but it seems to fit down in there and kind of can grab behind it. Think about putting this in a vise and then tapping on this with my orange mallet, see if I can get this bearing to come out. One thing I want to note is there's room behind the bearing, so this bearing isn't pushed all the way down. It actually is, you know, sitting there at a certain depth, so I can look at the side and see that there's a flange right here, and it's just below that, you know, maybe a 1/16 of an inch below the top surface here. So I'm just going to kind of memorize that, so when I'm installing the new one, I put it at that same depth. Depth's probably not that important because the shaft of the back side of that input shaft is quite large. It's just got to be able to grab somewhere there to give it some support. So we're going to try and get this out. It may get ugly, but and we'll get the new one pushed in as well. Alright, that took a lot longer than I thought and a little bit more difficult than I thought. Probably the most difficult thing we've done so far, but basically, you know, the old, this thing pulling it out kind of like a traditional bearing puller didn't work, but maybe because it was just kind of stuck on the sides. Maybe if I put some penetrating oil down in there, I could have, and maybe if I pushed it in a little bit first and then pulled it out, this would have worked. You know, I could have tried that again if I had to do it again. Ultimately, what I had to do is use an old chisel. This is like a woodworking chisel. It's my sacrificial thing. I use it for all kinds of crazy things and just sharpen it back up. But by using it and going in here and breaking this upper seal right here and getting it on this edge down here, I actually got it where it broke off, and removing all those needle bearings, I was then able to get this metal awl, sharp pointed awl, kind of between the surface of this and this, and it basically flared in enough where this thing, I could reduce the diameter of it and get it pulled out. But you know, interesting. I was expecting this to be maybe marred up. There is not I cannot feel anything. Zero damage on this. So we actually got lucky. And obviously, if you did damage this, you could just buy another one. But that did not hurt this at all. So we're actually ready to go ahead, and I'm going to install the new needle bearing back in here, and that way we can keep moving forward. Okay, so by heating up that bearing, and I put a little bit of this coil and on the shaft, it's super thin and super slick. I was able to get that to sit right down where it needed to. Otherwise, you got to use a special tool and use an arbor press, a tool that'll go over this shaft, but only press on that inside portion of the bearing. You never want to press on the outside. So we got that installed. Alright, I spent about an hour and a half on this thing, just kind of cleaning this up and getting it prepped for paint. Put it down in a tub with some purple power, used a regular scrub brush and a wire brush, and even a screwdriver to get down and loosen up the caked on grease down in these corners and stuff. But it was just a long time. And then actually a rotating brush on these surfaces here. You know, the machining on this is, they machined it where it's flat, but it's not error proof, and that's what the liquid gasket material is really going to just flatten it out, make it seal. All right, the next steps, we're going to tape this up, and all these surfaces we don't want paint to get on, and then I'm going to hit it with a VHT primer, and then finally a VHT black paint. I did and just finished, and it's drying now. Rub this down with a wax and grease remover. It's cast iron. You're not going to get all the grease out of here. And realistically, paint job has just got to last as long as this video stays up. It's, you know, if the paint comes off after I get this installed, I'm not that worried about it. But I think it's going to turn out pretty nice. So next time you see it, it'll be nice and painted up. Well, it's time to start putting this stuff back together. This is the front output shaft assembly that we've just kind of reassembled, and now we're going to be able to put this back into the case. Here's the clutch sleeve. We go ahead and pre-install that on that assembly. Insert it into the case. And before it's fully inserted, you want to install this gear with those teeth facing the shaft. Now we got that all in place. We're ready to put in the bearing. Before we can put that bearing in, we're going to heat it up a little bit to about 130 degrees, so that it expands just a little bit. It'll slip right onto that sleeve. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start installing this rear output shaft. And in doing so, I started just kind of preparing to get things together, and I noticed an issue. You remember in the very beginning, I told you that this transfer case came out of the 1980 year model Jeep, and it's got that the short rear tail shaft. In fact, here's that assembly. This is a kind of a shorter shaft, a shorter assembly that happens to be for this year model. And because of that, this actual shaft is different than, let's say, the 81 through 86 models. And the kit that I bought, I'm assuming was really for the 80, 86, because what happens is the bearing, here's the original bearing, it goes down, there's an interference fit. You know, it basically is going to slip onto this, do an interference slip onto that land right there. This is a 25-877 bearing. In the kit, they gave me a 25-880 bearing. And when I put this on, there's no interference fit, and that obviously is not going to work. So I'm just going to chalk it up to the fact that, you know, this is one of a different model. And you know, if you're doing an 81 through 86, you're not going to have that problem, because it does come with, I'm assuming, the correct bearing for that. So I just went out on the internet and basically bought another 877 bearing. That's right here. So we're going to use that to install. So that was one issue there. The second issue is I just happened to take my clutch sleeve and try and stick it on there, and it was pretty tough. And so what I ended up doing is just kept rotating it around. I put a mark, and I rotated this thing around enough to where I found a position that I really like. Like if I put it here, it slides in, and it's gonna do what I need to do. If I rotate this 90 degrees, it goes on, but it's a tough fit. I would not want that. So I went ahead and marked it that way. When it does come time to install this, after it's in there, I would just be able to line the marks up. It'll slide right on. It'll be right where I want it to be. So let's get this thing installed. Alright, so the next steps, 9 through 12, they want us to rebuild this. And I already did that. When I took this apart, I like taking little assemblies apart and putting them back together. So this has already been put together. There's a bearing down in there, this gear, snap ring, and they do want us to check the clearance on this, between this gear and that snap ring, 3 thousandths. And so I went ahead and here's a 3 thousandths feeler gauge, and it's just super tight. So it does not want to exceed 3,000. So it's something, basically it's 3,000s. It may be 2,000. It doesn't really matter. It's within tolerance. So this guy's good. And then the next thing they want us to do after rebuilding that is go ahead and push on this clutch sleeve, and let's get this thing turned up and then spun around. There's a small mark here and on that here in there where it's going to go, so I can see it right there. So I'm going to slide this way. So let's go like this. See, that slides in and out really easily. So now that we got that clutch sleeve in there, they want us to put in this front drive shaft support. Now, before I assemble all this, I've not seen anything in the instructions, but I kind of want to start lubricating these bearings. They're dry. They've got some, lubricant on there that they shipped with, but other than that, they're pretty dry. So there's that needle bearing inside there that we put in to the output rear output shaft. I want to put some lubricant on that, as well as there's a bearing down inside here. So I went and looked in the manual. It talks about an 8590 gear oil that's GL5. I found an 8090, and this says it's exceeds surface levels of GL4 and GL5. So made by Lucas. That's a very, very well named brand. So this is what I'm going to use. And I'm getting 2 of these because that's what's going to be ultimately what I use in this thing. So I went ahead and poked a small little hole in there, and I'm hoping I can get some of that squeezed in. Alright, there's not a gasket that came in the kit for this, and there wasn't a gasket when I pulled it off, so I don't expect to be a gasket, but it does need to be sealed. So I'm going to use this Permatex gasket maker. It's an anaerobic liquid gasket maker. We're going to put it really thin. I'm going to put it on this surface here, as well as, since these are through hole on these guys, we're going to definitely use some it's a medium strength Permatex thread locker blue on the bolts. And these get torqued down to 10 foot-pounds. Okay, so we got a little bit of ooze out on that gas material. I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to use a razor blade to scrape it off. I've got a clocking wheel that's going to go on here, and I think it's going to have a pretty tight fit against this diameter, so I do want to get that out of there. But I'll get that out of here after it dries. Again, this is the front input shaft, the front output shaft. The next thing we're going to do on the back side is start putting this rear output shaft tail housing on.
Jack it up.